Welcome to our final training video, believe it or not, in the book of Proverbs, and it will be on friendship, which will be our last study. Of course, there are many other topics and themes and life lessons in Proverbs. It was never the intention of the book of our first studies in Proverbs to be complete or exhaustive. So in many ways, even after your journey in Proverbs for this first term, I would encourage you to encourage your groups to continue reading and considering Proverbs in their day-to-day lives. This is really just to get people, basically to get our feet wet in the book of Proverbs and to get people excited about it and have a feel for it when they start reading it. And I'd encourage you to tell people to continue their journey as they continue in the book of Proverbs, or as we even end now, that they'd continue. But just looking at the context on this topic of friendship, which is quite important to see, is remember there are those three things you can relate Proverbs to, and in many ways that's in study 3, you can look at that. But there's the creation aspect, there is the law aspect, there is the nation of Israel during the kingdom aspect. But just for the friendship one, might be worth remembering it at the back of your mind, Genesis 1 verse 26 to 27, when God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And it's fascinating that God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Notice this, male and female he created them. All I want to bring out here is that God is Trinity. That's later on revealed in the scriptures. And as Trinity, God says he will make us collectively in his image. And he does that by making us a community. Male and female, he created them. And so it's worth just remembering that our relationships, our friendships, our community should reflect something of God's own friendship, relationships, community as Trinity. But just getting to the book of Proverbs itself, which touches on this and how we relate to one another, Proverbs 1 to 9 does mention to the son to be very careful regarding his company. So in Proverbs 1:10, in the very beginning, it says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." Basically saying in that section, if they tell you to go this way, don't go with them, don't associate with them, don't basically follow them or make intimate relationships with them. It's not a good idea. It ends in destruction as he continues on. But in Proverbs 7 verse 4, for example, he says, "Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your kinsman, intimate friend." This is a type of people you should befriend, or be the type of friend, a person of wisdom who fears the Lord. And so this context that we can then delve into the sayings in Proverbs on relationships or friendships, realizing that company is important. It's important who we choose to be our friends and what type of friend we should be, but also it relates to creation, how we've been designed to be. So when we get into the bulk of the sayings, and there are many more than I've put down here, but it's interesting that there's three major categories that Proverbs talks about friendship. It's impact, power, and influence, or the company, which could be wrong company and good company. And regarding its impact, there's just three major things to see here. I mean, there's other Proverbs that touches on this as well, but for example, Proverbs 18 verse 24 mentions that there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. So sometimes friends are actually closer than our own relatives. That's how close they can get. And also, like Proverbs 27 verse 9 to 10 points out, oil and perfume, which are very expensive commodities that are used to refresh a person. It says actually that as those things make the heart glad, make us look healthy as well, the sweetness of a friend comes from his earnest counsel. Friends, true friends, become good counselors, and if they've got honest counsel, it's actually refreshing to our souls. And tied to this is the next verse, which is, "Do not forsake your friend or your father's friend, and do not go to your brother's house on the day of your calamity." Why? Because better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away. You'll often find that friends form your greatest support structure when you are in need, when you're in trouble. Family isn't always around, but friends are, and that's what makes them so precious. But then tied to this in the same chapter, and that's why it's mentioned, is this one about relationships. Iron sharpens iron and one man sharpens another. It's a vivid image. Iron sharpens iron. It's a blacksmith using a whetting stone, basically to sharpen the edge or the blade. And so the Proverbs, the saying is basically saying that one man does the same to another man. It sharpens us. Relationships give us an edge. They sharpen and shape us and mold us into the people we are. And it's with this idea, these proverbs, there's these other proverbs about friendship and relationships that are interspersed. And quite overwhelmingly, most of the proverbs are actually about wrong company. So for example, Proverbs 22 verse 24 to 25, make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man. Why? And there's a reason, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Just a couple of things to mention. This idea here in Hebrew, it's almost like a bull that blows the picture is like a bull blowing his nostrils in anger. Literally a hothead, someone who's completely heated up or burning with anger, and is saying that's not the type of person you should be friends with, who continually is mastered by his temper. And the reason is you will become an angry person yourself, lest you learn his ways. And this idea of entangle yourself in a snare, it's not a light-hearted thing. It's actually always used negatively in the Bible. You can see that in the leader's notes. There's multiple references, but it's always referenced in the idea of being in trouble, and ultimately that trouble causing your own destruction. And that's important to see. So wrong company is ill-tempered company. But then tied to this, another one is the idea of unforgiveness or gossiping. So for example, a dishonest, perverse man spreads strife. A whisperer, another way of translating is a grumbler, separates close friends. Here, whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter, notice the repeat of this phrase, separates close friends. And what we need to see is firstly the word grumbler there. It's actually the same word, a whisperer here, but grumbler is another translation of it. It's the same word used of Israel in the wilderness. Rather than going to God, speaking to God of their troubles, they grumble among themselves, basically slandering God among themselves. And he's saying if someone acts like that, when they grumble against other people behind their backs, a whisperer, they ultimately separate those friendships. That's gossiping. But also someone who's unforgiving, but he who repeats a matter. Basically someone who can't cover an offense, who can't forgive the offense, but has to keep on exposing it or revealing it to others and the person and himself. Same consequence, it separates close friends. This is wrong company. And we should avoid this, being like this, a grumbler and a person who can't forgive. And we shouldn't befriend people or make intimate contacts or acquaintances with people who are in the habit of grumbling and who are unforgiving. Because I think just like the angry person, it rubs off and will ultimately sour your other relationships. But the unique thing to Proverbs for me is the emphasis, and quite an overwhelming emphasis, on the poor and how we relate to the poor. There are other sayings, I haven't put them in here, they're in the notes, but Proverbs 14:20-21 is a good summary. It just mentions that in the world the poor is disliked even by his neighbor, but as it is, the rich has many friends. This proverb is actually not approving this, and we see it's not approving this if you just look at the next part. Whoever despises his neighbor, which includes the poor, by the way, is a sinner, but blessed he is generous to the poor. So notice the difference. A person who despises the poor, who dislikes them, is like a sinner. That's used in Proverbs 1 verse 10 regarding a robber, a gang of people who are cruel to other people. Just as much as robbers and gangs have a disregard for another person's humanity being made in God's image, so a person who dislikes the poor, who despises the poor, is actually the same. They've just as little regard for the poor. And interestingly, it says, blessed from God's perspective is one who's generous to the poor, who does not dislike the poor. Tied to this is interesting, Proverbs 14:31 and 17:5 makes a direct link between how we relate to the poor and God who made them. Because remember, as Genesis 1 says, we're made in his image. And it says, whoever oppresses or mocks a poor man insults his maker. It's God's image that you're attacking. But he who is generous to the needy honors him, honors God, because you are honoring his image. And so it's important to see it's wrong company to be in the company of those who dislike the poor, who are not friends with the poor, basically classism. And we shouldn't be people who are tempted to be classist, because we are people who believe every human being is made in God's image. But then beautifully, good company, of which true friendships exist, and this is a beautiful refrain in Proverbs, is the company of those who can cover over all wrongs, who covers an offense, who seeks love, basically, who overlooks an offense. Notice the theme of love. That's a friendship that can work. Love that wants to forgive, not repeat a matter. Love that wants to cover, not grumble and gossip about it. It's in that context where someone forgives that you're able to have a true friendship. You'll see it in the saying in the handout, which we'll discuss. That's just a fountain of friendship. The key to it is forgiveness, which is motivated by love. But when we get to the Gospels, how does it relate to the Gospel? It actually becomes quite clear. I mean, there's multiple verses. I mean, this is just a classic one to show how Jesus related to people. He was well known to be a friend of tax collectors and sinners, the people who were despised, the disliked, the marginalized, those who the classes rejected. That's exactly the people Jesus befriended. And he was ridiculed for it. But that's okay. He came to rescue God's image. And that's why he came. And there's multiple other verses. Jesus forgave and died for his friends, covering for them. You can see the verses in the leader's notes. But maybe the one to consider is when you actually read 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 to 7. Now, Jesus is important because he actually lives according to 1 Corinthians 13, 4 to 7. He is the pattern of this. Ephesians 5, 1 to 2 tells us this is how we need to love, like Jesus, imitating him. But notice, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast, nor is arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, it's not irritable or resentful, it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. There's that idea of the wounds of a friend. Notice, love bears all things, believes all things, endures all things. This is a beautiful picture of not allowing, basically, another person's wrongdoing to derail the friendship, but being patient and kind, and not to be irritable or resentful, but bearing and enduring is a mark of friendship. It's a mark of what it means to love. It's that forgiving disposition. Notice it points out it does not rejoice in wrongdoing. The wounds of a friend, as Proverbs says, is good, but rejoices with the truth. But the overarching feel is patience and kindness, a sense of bearing and forgiving, covering. But notice as well, it's not classist. Love is not classist. It does not envy or boast, which is about pride. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. There's humility there, a care for another person. And when you look at the Church of Corinth, you can see it in the leader's notes, they were exactly all the things, if we go back, they were exactly all the things that the wrong company is the people we should not be. That's actually the Church of Corinth. And Paul is motivating them, you need to be like this, church. He even says in his final letter that you need to consider where you stand with God if you find that you do not live this way. Because if Christ is in you, then this is how you live. And in many ways, Proverbs is lived out by Jesus, but we are empowered by Jesus to live out those Proverbs in friendship. And that's what I'd say is Proverbs on friendship in a nutshell.